Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Aney.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summit.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, this is Jyri Raitsolo from the Finnish National Defence University.
And this is John Spencer from the Modern War Institute.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Three different war experts all talking about different things. John and I are at least 1,000 miles apart, and then Jyri's in Finland, and it's night where he is, and heck, I've got morning tea here trying to get my voice into shape for this show. But I wanted to have you guys on because I want to one, just for posterity, capture this conversation because there's quite a bit of different view of this. So John works at the Modern War Institute, which is it's the U.S. Military Academy's institute talking about modern war and how we deal with it. Jyri, who's actually a lieutenant colonel in the Finnish military, works at the Finnish National Defence University, and he's a professor there. So he's learning about and talking about what we have to do in terms of modern conflict, primarily in the European theater, but in general, how do we stay prepared? And I'm sure if I get these things wrong, these guys are going to correct me. And I'm just a knucklehead who's been outside of the wire so much. I look at the absolute below the tactical, what's the ground truth. And so we're going to try to have a conversation trying to understand some of these big moving parts, because war is interesting to talk about, and talking about the future, what might happen is really challenging. So fellas, let's take a swing at this and see if we can't figure out what the heck we need to be doing, or more of or less of or whatever. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, me too.
Let's define what modern war is. And John, since you work at the Institute for Modern War, give me an idea. How do you want to define modern war?
Oh, thanks, Pete. Thanks for the easy one. Thanks for the easy softball right there.
Right up to the top. Yeah.
War. Not to get back into the classroom, but it's modern war. So it encompasses everything from state on national security approaches to conflicts. So whether you define a war as a recognized conflict or just the persistent activity of protecting your national interests around the globe. And then warfare, is more what people understand of, battles, firefights, whether it's proxy warfare, where you have non-state actors like Russia sending people in plain clothes to just create political unrest in a country they don't want to cause them problems. It covers the whole gamut, but modern war is everything from the president's decisions or the national leaders' decisions on whether they're going to engage in an area because it's a security interest or national interest. It could be an economic interest. It could be many interests, all the way down to the Joe who's shooting a rifle because he's told to.
And Jyri, what would you say? How do you, in Finland, as a professor and an active duty dude, how do you define modern war?
Well, Pete, for me, war is the large-scale use of violence in order to achieve your political goals, whatever those might be. Usually, when states are doing it, it's the national interest in a way. But I think that John is totally right when what he just described, because for me, our notions of war have diffused really. We have such a wide notions. Everybody is talking about these days cyber war, hybrid war, political warfare, information war. So war is everywhere all the time, and I think that's a little bit analytically a problem. So I think that is something that we should talk less about, framing all the problems in the world as war. Because for me, if you want to have it a useful analytical concept, you need to have it kind of tied down to something, and for me that is large-scale use of violence.
Yeah, you're right. It's a good point to stop here and explore a little bit. Politically in the U.S., I would say the left more than the right are talking about civil war, right? We're in a civil war. And it's like, oh, we're in a civil war? Okay, you guys clearly don't know the grisly grinding nature of brothers killing brothers and people assassinating one another, and what a civil war in America would look like. And if we are, just say when, because I'm good at war. I'll be fine. I'll start, imposing my will on people and things, and nobody wants that. So it's not really a war. But when you say that there isn't cyber war and or it's not proper to define that as war, or all of the different, I guess you would say, I don't know, espionage-based things where you're trying to find out things or disrupt things for one another. If that isn't war, then maybe what is that?
Well, I think that's a really good question because, for me, looking at what states are doing, what Russia is doing, or what China is doing, or what we in the West are doing, quite a lot of that falls for me into the category of, a normal international politics. It's not always benign. In many cases, it's really malign intent and malign methods. So in a way, kind of, in order to have this kind of a distinction of influencing others, which I would say is normal thing, you try to get others do as you would like them to do without using violence. So that's being smart. So for me, it is important to kind of have some kind of an analytical category for war that is different from normal politics. And the other point would be that if everything is war these days, how can you conceptually escalate when things start really getting violent? If we are at war already, what's going to happen when we go onto a higher level, when people start actually getting killed on a massive scale, and we are facing much bigger destruction than today? So I do think that we are doing ourselves a disservice by labeling everything war just because some people think that it's really interesting what they're talking about and important.
John, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I 100% agree with everything Ari said, but I also, after I retired and had kids, I've relaxed a little bit, and whether somebody says that there's a war on poverty, there's a war on drugs, I think it's okay. One, after trying to learn somebody else's language and understand that one word can have 1,000 meanings, as long as we all have a shared understanding of the conversation we're in. So if we're on TV and we're having a conversation about war on drugs or war on poverty, then that's fine. I mean, it means a hard effort. But if we're talking about political violence, if we're talking about the spectrum of armed conflict, and I agree with Ari. I mean, we define strategy as the use of force or the threat of use of force to achieve our political goals. And as long as when we're having a conversation, even this one, if we all have a shared understanding, like, okay, what are we talking about? And if it's war, are we talking about state actors, or just like you said, the ground local guys where two gangs are fighting it out? I mean, I'm sure in their minds they're engaged in war, but if depending on what kind of conversation we're having, there's no political goal, and they're just violence is the end of itself for them. It's hard to talk past each other, but I think if we have a shared understanding of it, we're fine.
And in terms of politics, we're talking national or state level politics, state being the big nation states. We're not talking about local politics. We're not talking about gang politics. We're talking about how big nations accomplish things against one another, or how large groups internally fight the nation. Is that what you're saying?
So it always depends. Yeah. So what we say is we never say no. We always say yes and. So yes and yes. If we're talking, if a U.S. position, it's always what the political goals. But if we're in a country where there is no recognized political authority, it's I like to have more conversations about power. If it's a nation state where the state maintains, for a reasonable perspective, all the power and authority, then that's the conversation we want to have. We want to look at bring it up to the strategy. But if you're down in parts of, and this, if you're in parts of Afghanistan and you're out in the hinterlands, you can talk politics all you want, but it's about power. It's about who owns power in state and in areas as big as our states. And we're still down there talking about, but this is the political goal. It doesn't matter in that situation. It becomes a question of who owns the power. And then if there's a recognized power like a nation state, then we can start talking about, okay, what are the politics and the political goals of this actually ground. And I think I really like although I don't go into the classroom again, but the difference between the character of war and the nature of war. If we're down there at the ground level talking about the nature of war, we better be talking about power, not politics.
Well,
Yeah,
I must say, I agree with what John is saying. Maybe one qualification for me is that when we deploy our forces, our state-based military forces to do operations, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, I do think that there needs to be a clear political goal. The kind of use of violence needs to serve a purpose, and we have to kind of be able to define what that goal is, and are we achieving it or not? And if not, should we double down, put more troops in, or should we, someday decide that this was that worth a try, but we have failed, and just get back home?
yeah, doubling down and sending more troops, pretty easy. Going home without accomplishing the stated goal, impossible.
It's really hard. Yeah.
Well, because your stated goal on day one isn't your stated goal on year 17.
Precisely.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and those things do change because the guy on the ground in Afghanistan, you're 100% right, John. Like, we want to establish stability, so we're going to build you a government and a tax base. Like, well, we don't even have a criminal penal system in a lot of states. They handle everything through civil settlements, and they don't need a courthouse to do that. So now you have to convince a body, Afghans, Iraqis, whoever it's going to be, that they need a court system, which means they have to pay taxes, which means someone who's afraid to even go out in their own neighborhood now has to go out and take money legally from people hundreds of miles from where they're from, with no platoon to enforce this thing. That's crazy to think that you can expect a place in a conflict-ridden place to be able to go out and collect taxes to fund even just a criminal court system.
Yeah, I mean, it's back to the medieval Dark Ages. I mean, they did it back then by basically occupying foreign lands and having and maintaining the power to do that. And if you're not going to pay your taxes, we'll make you.
And I think it's really important, that we realize this kind of reality on the ground down there, wherever that is, so that when we are making our own choices, then we have a clear understanding of what can we actually achieve with deploying troops and using violence there.
Let's talk about what's going on right now, because there's a lot of specific things. But let me you kind of dove into power a little bit. Let me first ask us this. So in terms of power has to move around a little bit, right? It seems like when power breaks out, that we get real problems of, okay, something big has happened, and I'll just use the Crimea, where Russia seizes ships. And it's like, whoa, hold on, you've overstepped your bounds as far as what the world's comfortable. I'm talking like the people that care about that kind of thing. And so that then you have to push back with more power to contain that. Are we pretty good at holding power back from breaking out and causing real significant conflict? We always feel like the World War I breakout where everybody's tied together and it's like, I'm obligated to go to this war. We like you guys, but we're in a deal with these guys. What do we do about the transfer of power, Jyri?
Well, I would say first of all that I think there has been some kind of a fallacy about this globalizing world of when after the Cold War ended. I think that, there has been quite many nasty places with huge problems, and we have been trying to tame those places during the last 25 years. And I think that the lesson, at least for me, is that it's really hard to get positive results out with the use of military force. In most cases, there are going to be unintended consequences on a massive scale that we can't foresee when we deploy troops. So I do think that for me personally, in a way, maybe it's a strategic level lesson learned is that we need some kind of a restraint, more restraint than we have had so far, because we can't deal with all the problems or all the manifestations of negative power that we can see throughout the globe.
John?
So, I mean, it's a great conversation. I'm not sure we could talk for a long time, but I call it the game. So we, as in the recognized nation states, have agreed to most of the rules of the game, and some people follow those rules to the letter of the law. Whether you're talking the United Nations rules of, Article 5, you threaten one, you attack all, or if you're Russia, you know the rules of the game and you know where to bend them and to the point of just below the level of collective action against you. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand when all this stuff happens around the world is, are the actors part of the game, or are they in a really nasty place? And I know we'll talk about it in like Syria and other places where they're not playing the game, or they don't really care about the game. But I think Russia is probably the masters of, I know the rules and I'll bend them right up to the point of collective action. I was at a conference recently, and really one of the most provocative things, especially from the use of military force and talking about when do we go to war, things like that. The guy said, you all are having a conversation like that. We're going to one day enter into full-scale war with a nation that has nuclear power, and everybody's going to be fine with it staying below the threshold of nuclear action. So we're going to have this big battle with Russia and China, but they're not going to use. It's going to stay below that threshold that we all know is a part of the game. We all must stay below the threshold that somebody's going to use a nuclear weapon. But we plan like we're going to have this big giant battle against somebody, and it's below this nuclear threshold, which is part of the rules of the game that we established after World War II.
Yeah, and also if you look at the rules of the game and staying below the threshold, I would also say that, isn't it so that what we are talking about being the gray zone or being hybrid warfare, quite a lot of that is in a way playing with the rules that you don't even go conventional with your military. So in a way, you try to use all other levers of power, trying to minimize the use of traditional conventional military power, not to mention the nuclear card. So in a way, one part of that is also positive, I would say, that we can compete without overt aggression or large-scale violence. So it is not only negative, although I would like to say, of course, connected to this, that I totally understand that there are many actors, states and non-state actors, that are doing really nasty stuff, and we need to counter many of those actions.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit, because it turns out Finland shares a long border with Russia, and also the Baltic states have a lot of people may not realize this, but the Baltics are Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and they're on the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. And there's a sizable chip of Russia that's forced in on the coast there, and it's called Kaliningrad, and there's all sorts of weapons. It's a military thing. It's also a port, so they want to be able to get through things. But all of these things, you guys are right there in it. When you see Russia's actions, what's the Finnish point of view? What's your point of view, Jyri?
Well, I think that our point of view has been for a quite long time rather stable, and that is that for Finland, the thing that we need to have is real national hard warfighting capabilities, and then the other part is that we are doing cooperation with other states of similar interests in Europe. So I think that quite a lot of European states got rid of their traditional conventional warfighting capabilities when the Cold War ended. We didn't. So I would say that is a kind of the main difference in framework between Finland and some quite many European states. They went all volunteer forces, or rather small forces, focusing mostly on expeditionary warfare, whether in the name of crisis management, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency operations. So the logic for military defense has diverged in Europe somewhat. After 2014, after Russia annexed Crimean Peninsula and started the military conflict in Eastern Europe, I would say that the focus in Europe overall has shifted a little bit. Maybe a little bit back towards the more traditional notions about defense and deterrence. And there's quite a lot of talk about deterrence these days in Europe and within NATO. Quite a lot of experts and expertise have been lost or withered away during the last 25 years. So I think there is a need in Europe, particularly, to think about what constitutes deterrence these days.
How does Finland is sizable, but a lot of the country is hard to navigate around it, and I'm imagining along the border between you and Russia, there's a lot of forest. How do you guys maintain, one, the capability to operate joint and internationally, but also defend that border against a massive foe should they decide to? I mean, obviously, if they push a bunch of tanks up to the north and try to mass along the border, you guys are going to do things, but at some point, you guys reach max capacity, don't you?
Yeah, but I think that for us, small state next to a military great power, I think that the logic goes that we have to deal or have working relations with Russia and with every other state in the region. So I think that it's mostly about foreign policy and diplomacy, and the military is on the background. That's our job, to have enough power, in a way, to have this kind of a porcupine defense of being nasty enough. So if anybody tries, to come to Finland militarily and achieve their objective, so that we can say no. We can never muster same amount of military power that Russia does. But that's not what our defense is based on. I think that our defense is based on the notion that if somebody tries to get something positive with their military forces in Finland, they will fail, and they will have to pay a huge price to get in here, and that price is going to be so high that they are not going to do it. So I would say that it's twofold. Having good relations, normal relations. We must do diplomacy all the time, even during crises, and then on the background having a good enough military.
And then how closely are you guys aligned with the Baltic states, the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania?
Well, their security is based, military security, defense is based in the membership of NATO. They are all members of NATO, and Finland is not. So in a way, we have different kinds of solutions, and it's totally normal for this kind of thing. They were just independent when the Cold War ended. They had no kind of legacy for their defense. So I think that going as quickly as possible to become members of the European Union and NATO was really practical for the Baltic states. For us, it's a little bit different. We have a long legacy of first of all, fighting wars against the Soviet Union in the 30s and 1940s, and every year, every decade after that, the basic notion of why do we have military defense? It's to deter any kind of military aggression against the state. So I think we have totally different traditions, a totally different history, and that's why we're also having different kinds of security political defense policy guidelines these days.
John, when it comes to these kind of things, and you look at the complexities of you have the Baltic states, you have NATO and the capacities that those guys have, and then you have weird ass Finland that won't play along and be part of NATO, and we're trying to chill out the Crimea, where Russia is. Look, who's right and who's wrong doesn't really matter. If they go to full on fighting, and other things can break out, right? This is the opportunity that Poland's been waiting for to push their border to the east because Russia's just, all these things start to come into play. What the heck do you do as someone who's working at the theoretic or strategic level to try to manage? I mean, Europe is a relatively stable place. Most of our conflicts are in other places. But here, like this one thing devolves the whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it woke up a lot of people I think from the U.S. perspective is not that we're in an arms race, but we're always looking at who we view as our near peer and the capabilities. So if for some reason World War III below the nuclear threshold broke out, we'd have overmatch in military capabilities that are so that we could assist an ally or to defeat a near peer in a full out scale war. And I think that's one of the differences between the United States and most other countries is that that's not economically feasible for most other states around the world, except for these, big powers of Russia, China. So, those three big powers are always in this competition to match each other's capabilities, whether it's ground, Air Force, Navy, long strike, you name it. But when you get down to the politics of the European continent, like you said, it gets really complex. And I'm really happy Jyri discussed some of those other forms of power, which, the diplomatic, the information, the military, and the economic, which are all levers to pull in the situation. But you also mentioned, you Pete, about, and I sat through a really good brief on Russia and their incursions into the Ukraine and in all the Baltic states about taking from their vantage point. We always believe, we think we know, we place this rational thought on Russia. Like we know what they're thinking. And one of the arguments there was, and it made a lot of sense we're all talking about how they annex Crimea and how they're doing all these bad things. And if you put yourselves in their shoes and talk about a post-Soviet Union, post-World War II redrawing of the boundaries, and has the European continent continued to push into and up against Russia, where they thought that was not the agreement, and now it looks like they are being threatened as a nation state and slowly being chipped away at their capabilities or their countries or even their pseudo citizens that are all along these borders. We always think we know what they're thinking, and I don't think that's true. And I can kind of see hey, you keep encroaching on us. Yeah, how long do we take this?
I think John has a couple of really good points here. First of all, we don't share a paradigm with Russia these days on security, defense, or war even. We are seeing different things when we're talking about security in Europe. And I think it's really, really important to understand your adversary and how other players think and how they prepare for policy and how they prepare their militaries. The other point that John made, I think is really good, that Europe is a big continent with small states. There are a couple of medium-sized powers, UK, France, and Germany, for example. But most European states are rather small, with small resources, though the militaries are small. And they have different kinds of very diverging strategic interests. Some are interested in the Middle East region. Some are looking at the Mediterranean and North Africa, Sahel Africa. Some countries like the UK and Denmark are looking transatlantic relations and to the US. Norway, some other countries are interested in the Arctic region, some are looking at Russia. So there are so many kind of key national security interests in Europe with small militaries, that it's really hard to say that Europe is doing something. There are many Europes. And in this regard, if we are looking at deterrence, military deterrence in Europe, I would say these days it mainly comes from the US.
Wow, there are many Europes. I'd never really thought about that, but that goes exactly to what John was saying. It's like, depending on where the power is being exchanged, yeah, it's a different Europe. Because Turkey is part of Europe, and that's, talk about crazy. Not that Turks are crazy, but just the political aspirations and the power that's within Turkey and how it affects it's totally different than, say, Paris, which is a mess right now. I mean, it's just a mess. Jyri, talk a little bit about how you guys see Paris and the influx of, I guess we have to be fair and honest and say, immigration into Europe from the Middle Eastern states has created some uncertainty, at least in some parts of the population. Is that helping to undermine what's going on? Is it socialism, showing some of its marks, or what the heck is going on? And how do you look, nobody loves a revolution like the French. What happens if they go into full revolt and there's a new person on top in 6 months?
Well, I don't think it's socialism rising again, but I would say that what we are witnessing in some countries, or quite many countries in Europe, is a longer-term development where societies have become somewhat unhealthy in a way that they have become quite divided. An increasing amount of citizens are feeling that they are not part of the society, that they are not responsible stakeholders anymore, that the society is not for them, whether it's the unemployed or badly educated. So in a way, there's a growing number of people who actually want to kind of show the middle finger to the political establishment by rioting or doing all kinds of crazy stuff, whether it's in social media or somewhere else. So I do think that quite a lot of what we are seeing in Europe is mostly there is no military or kind of security related solutions. They are mostly about having healthy societies, and what that needs is better education. Some kind of welfare for people who are left without a job, and so on and so on.
Yeah. Let me ask you guys this, because I've got a friend that's very, he likes disruption. He likes, I guess it would be unfair to say anarchy, but he does have an anarchy tattoo on his forearm. We're talking about a lot of complex things, right? And he posted the other day, like, let's just cut the U.S. defense budget by 50%. They can get by with that amount of money and put that money and invest it back into society, right? Kind of to Jyri's point, like, people are complaining about not having enough. But in this conversation, we've also talked about the nuclear threshold. And if we think that these things can be managed on trust alone, is it possible to run a defense budget, at least the U.S.'s defense budget? Let me ask you this way. Jyri, do you want to have the U.S. as a partner cutting its defense budget by 50%? How does that impact how you see things?
Well, I wouldn't. I do think that the U.S. Is a positive force in Europe. It has the capabilities and it has credibility. So I do think that the U.S. cutting half of its military budget would be really bad, mostly for those states that are basing their security in the military sphere in NATO, because a U.S. with a much smaller budget on a long-term basis would not be as credible an actor within the framework of NATO. So I definitely would like to see that. What could be, of course, a good thing is that I think we have already seen that during the last decade, that there is more kind of calculations on where to engage actively with military forces. There are many problems, for example, in Africa these days that need some kind of responses. But every time a decision is made concerning the use of military forces, I think there needs to be a lot of restraint and a lot of kind of analysis before going in.
John, what do you think about cutting the budget by 50%? What is that? Let's just take that. Let's just say that's preposterous. Let's just cut it by 25%. A couple less carrier groups, minus one division. I don't know if we'd even get there with that. But what do you think in terms of massive cuts to the budget to invest in social systems?
I think that would be a childish risk to the global order. The amount of spending the U.S. military or the government spends on the U.S. military is because we've accepted our role on the global stage as a capability. I mean, you only have deterrence if you have capability, recognized capability, and the will to use it. And if you were to take a isolationist approach and say that we don't need that big of a military, and then your deterrence effect goes down and your ability to do anything goes down. So that makes a lot of sense if you think in 5 years you don't need your U.S. military, or if you think your U.S. military is only for homeland defense, which the U.S. military is not for that. We're a global power projection force that helps in maintaining the global order. Although I'm not saying we're the globe's policemen and that we shouldn't be sticking our noses in, and we do stick our noses in places I think we shouldn't. But if you don't have that deterrence effect, then the game that we've been talking about doesn't work. And then, an actor who does have that capability, like China and like Russia, just slowly starts pushing the edges of because they know you no longer have either the capability or the will to enforce the game. So China continues to push out into the South China Seas, and eventually they're pushing on Taiwan, and they're pushing on the Straits, and then Russia's pushing farther. So and if somebody had their way and cut the U.S. military by 50%, that's all good until we as a nation ask them to do something, because we view it as a tragedy. Whatever it is, whatever the scenario is, and the U.S. military is asked to do something that they can't because they no longer have the resources. So investing in your military is also investing in time. So you could say that you want to, if we needed to expand our military, like in World War II, global war breaks out, we do a big call to service and we just dump a bunch of money into it. What you get is a lackluster military. You don't get a professional military that can achieve something very quickly.
Yeah, I totally agree with John. There are no U-turns in defense policy. It's a long-term thing. 20 years is a short term in defense. If you look at for example, the U.S. capabilities, the main battle tanks, 70s technologies, M1 Abrams, of course, being upgraded over the years, but they will serve until something like 2050. Or the B-52s, some of the airframes are going to serve for 100 years. So there is a long legacy tail in defense for every country, and you just can't make very short-term, quick, revolutionary things. Even though we thought a couple of decades ago that we can actually do a revolution in military affairs, which I think we did it.
I think it's a great point. Just and without sounding like some type of uber nationalist. I mean, the only reason that 1970s technology that's stationed in Poland works is because a single brigade of 3,000 people against a whatever nation is because there is this global order of the U. If that speed bump, whatever that speed bump is, if you roll over it, then you get the rest of the capability that's coming behind it.
Yeah. There's something to be said. I always use the reason why the president of the United States is the most powerful man in the world. Sorry, Yuri, not to brag or nothing, but is because he can point and say, make a carrier group show up on this coast, and everybody in that region is like, oh, the things have changed here, and there's not a damn thing anybody can do to make that carrier group go away. It's an incredible thing, and it also checks up those rogue states like Iran and North Korea that would love to partner, that would love to be each other's ally, have certainly tried to pass nuclear capability back and forth. You lose the ability to sort of mute that down and compel compliance at a world level where the nations can agree. We don't want you two to be playing in the nuclear. Really, the world doesn't want more nuclear powers. We want less. And so the more we can say, if you're going to have nuclear capability, you're going to comply with this. Otherwise, everybody's going to be focused on you, and everybody's going to get hungry in your country. There won't be enough fuel, and you won't have the internet, and people will lose their minds. It's those massive cuts that people want. Yes, on the surface, it seems great, but I would suggest that the world becomes a much more war-filled place, and unless we like more war, we kind of have to have the U.S. spending money. Is that fair to say, fellas?
Well, for me, Pete, you mentioned Iran and North Korea, and looking at again a decade and a half into the history, I would say that having regimes and states being on the other side, even either they are adversaries or even enemies, I think that is something that actually you can make deterrence work. But if on the other side, in a way the regime and the state structures are destroyed, then you are going to be in a lot of trouble. And I think if you look at Libya or if you look at Iraq, then you can see that you may destroy the regime and you may destroy the government, but you might not end up in a better security situation. So I do think that there are many rogue regimes or bad regimes in the world, but the good part of those is that in 99% of the cases, they in a way play with the quite same rule book that we use, just like John was saying earlier.
Yeah, we had Dr. Bob Taguchi on. We were talking, this is about a little over a year ago, when we were talking about North Korea and trying to examine the whole, it's going to be World War III and what that really means. And as much as we don't like the actions and the dictatorial style of Kim Jong-un, having him in power is almost better than nearly any other solution out there. Is that, like, how do we get him, build him an off-ramp so he can chill out and at least just be contentious, as opposed to being out of control and hell bound to go and push a big button that you can't unpush. Let's talk a little bit. You talked about Libya. Let's talk about some of those Mediterranean states that are struggling, like Libya, like Syria. In terms of modern war, and Russia's playing. Help me understand this, fellas. What the heck do we do about this region, if anything?
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero, co-host of the Break It Down Show and fellow producer here at Lions Rock Productions. And I'm proud to announce our newest show coming in January. It's called Justice. Season 1 is going to be a deep dive into some of the cases I personally worked on as a licensed private investigator, and you'll get a unique view into the criminal justice system that may just challenge some of your personal notions about how it should work and open your eyes in ways you never imagined. So keep your ears open for Justice, a brand new podcast coming in January from Lions Rock Productions to iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
In terms of modern war, and Russia's playing, help me understand this, fellas. What the heck do we do about this region, if anything?
So I have no answers on what to do about it. All we can do is try to help understand. Especially from our perspective as students of modern wars, try to understand what's going on in there, and it's the complexity. There's no better area to address and try to understand the complexities of it, and they're all teachable. How do you understand it? Okay, let's break this apart and understand it. I think we just covered a bunch of topics. The one with the nuclear power. I mean, if I'm a rogue state, everybody has to understand the number one interest of any state is survival. That's it, period. So if you don't look at their state, whether if it's a rogue nation or it's an authoritarian, a dictatorship, their number one interest is survival. So the seeking nuclear power is because we don't invade people with nuclear power. And I think that was a great point that in the North Korea discussion. Now we're talking about the Middle East, Libya, Syria, you name it. And I think this is the counterpoint to Paris. Is despite all the rioting, despite how bad it's going to get, the nation state is not under threat of losing its power. There's no military coup about to happen in which the power turns on the government and tries to establish a new government. But in these places Libya and places like that, the governments have such a loose control of power, even with using militaries for internal disputes. It's so loose and so fragile that it just breaks apart. And then we're no longer talking about nation state politics now. We're talking about whatever it is that you call it, if it's a state anymore, but it's who's trying to struggle to maintain power over the use of force. So, managing violence and all functions of the government.
Yeah, I think also if you look at, around the world, I think there are approximately 60 states today that we can call fragile, that are on high alert, so that the kind of the regimes and the governments have no actual or good control of what's going on in the country. So I think that's also a problem for us. There's a lot of room for terrorists to maneuver and all kinds of other negative aspects. So that for me, this means kind of that if we really want to start policing the world, there's going to be a lot of work to be done during the next 100 years. About 60 states, if you look at the fragile state index that is coming out every year, that are on high alert.
Yeah, you're making a great point in terms of diplomacy and where you put effort. Most of the states are able to use diplomacy as their form of disagreement and management. And at some point, you get beyond the ability of diplomacy to work, and then hopefully you use modern war elements to corral that back and get that back within the world of diplomacy. But things that are outside of that norm, you can't reliably create an outcome. If rebuilding Syria into something that is cooperative and successful, that's just not. You can't reliably do that. Am I just being too doomsday driven, or do you think that I'm correct in that? Once you get outside of the norm, both politically and in terms of military, it's really hard to get that state to function as because look at the human atrocity that happens in these zones and just the forced immigration. You get people flowing into Europe who don't want to live there, but they have to live somewhere because where they are from, where they want to be, is not tenable anymore.
I think if we're talking about Syria, looking at the last 7-8 years, what's going on there, how many hundreds of thousands of people dead, more than 5 million people driven from the country to the neighboring countries. And today, if we start counting all the outside state actors that are involved, I think there's at least half a dozen that you name immediately, and then all other kind of non-state military groups, militias, whatever kind of forces. So it really is a mess today. It's really hard to understand, and it's really hard to give a positive outlook to Syria during the next decade's perspective, because there is so much baggage from last years, from the history, and there are so many violent actors using military force today in Syria.
I mean, I think it's a great point that you wouldn't have what you have in Syria if major other powers were involved. A nasty situation like this, without outside influence, would eventually recreate another government of some type. Especially if you're talking Syria, if Assad had fallen, a new state would have formed, but that didn't happen because other people intervened to save him. So then that causes us to then interact in this, gray zone below the threshold conflicts where we're really trying to achieve our interests on a playing field of another nation, I think some of these places would not stabilize, but they'd recreate something else. Whether it's like Iraq recreated itself to some type of stability in a different person's point of view. But when you have us, Russia, Syria, Iran, you name it, in there injecting ourselves into this game, it prolongs the creation of something new. And we're not going to go all in because not that we've learned our lesson, but let's say the big power of the United States or somebody else, the UK, France, somebody goes all in and says, we have to stop this. We have to restabilize something. Well, then you just bought it, and you're going to stay for a long time. They're trying to recreate something that's just not possible.
Yeah, boy. It's almost like you want to have a global nation-state level lumberjack match. Jyri, a lumberjack match is when you get a bunch of lumberjacks and they all kind of clear out a big circle, and they let the people in the middle, they fight until they don't want to fight anymore, and then you make them fight some more, and then finally one of them's like, fine, I give, right? But that's kind of what we do, except for there's, like you said, 5 million people displaced, hundreds of thousands of people in the middle of this lumberjack match, and it's really... The people that always complain and show the pictures of the kids, God bless. I mean, I know it's horrible, but legitimately, what are you going to do about it? There has to be some level of this fighting so they can get it out of their system. I mean, there's no real way to deflate a situation like that, is there?
Well, I think that, any human being would like to help all those people who are within this misery. But the problem is that we don't have the tools. Maybe the military tools are the only ones that we can actually have and we can use, but there's no guarantee of success, and in many cases it could go even to a worse situation. So I think that's the problem. We have no management tools to help these people out so far away.
Yeah,
I mean, you want the Leviathan, you want the authority that's going to reestablish all the political and governance structures. But nobody's stepping up to be that. The UN's not doing it. Nobody's going to step up and say, I'll take Syria. I'll recreate the nation. And you got to look through other people's eyes. I mean, Russia wants a pro-Russian government. And Bashar al-Assad is a pro-Russian, and especially in economic means. It is a part of Russia's national interest to maintain a very pro-Russian government there, although whether it's still as a government, even as today, is weak to say, but it's very advantageous to Russia to keep the conflict, to keep him in office so they maintain their national interests. What are our national interests over there, or what is anybody in NATO's national interests over there other than humanitarian rights, which is a big one, of course.
Yeah. So I want to change gears because we're running out of time. There's so many things to talk about, but I want to talk a little bit about modern conflict, modern war, and urban versus, like what you have to do in Finland, right? Like if you're constantly preparing for a Russian incursion, I guess you guys really aren't worried about Sweden or Norway, marching across the tops of the north and everything. So how do you balance, with the limited resources that any nation has, how do you balance that out where you maintain a robust forest-style fighting thing while maintaining a Middle Eastern desert-based campaigning capability, because you have to do that to be a good world partner, and then also, to John's expertise specifically, maintain that house-to-house, door-to-door, apartment-to-apartment. I mean, I can't imagine any environment harder to fight in than a high-density city where there's just so many variables for a commander that you are absolutely going to kill your own people, let alone people being able to attack your troops. How do you manage that stuff, Jyri?
For our defense concept, first of all, I think the basic point is that we don't do any finger pointing. Who is going to be the aggressor? I think that's the first thing, that trying to get along with everybody and try to hear what the others have what are the problems security wise, so that we can understand them better. So that's number one. Concerning the fighting force, how to train it. Well, as you know, we have general conscription, and our wartime troops are rather large. We have 280,000 soldiers. So we basically have two different kinds of troops. the one more local forces that they know the terrain, they know the cities where they are living normally, so they will be defending those. And then we have the more operational forces, maneuver forces that we can use throughout the country that are better equipped, that are younger, and so on. So I think that the kind of the key is that we have the mass on the ground, and then where decisive action needs to be taken, that we can do also. Concerning urban warfare, I totally agree. We are living in an urbanizing world, and we need to be able to fight in the cities. So I think that is a capability that we need. But from the Finnish perspective, I think when quite a lot of these futures trends studies say that the world is urbanizing, and we are going to see some megacities in the future, and we need to be able to fight in those. I don't think that from a Finnish defense concept perspective, those are that interesting. For us, it's more about looking at we have been an urban country for some time, and we need to have capabilities to defend in urban areas and also in the forest and terrain areas. But I don't think that we are going to develop our military forces to go into the megacities in third world anytime soon.
John?
So I wholeheartedly agree with Ari, and I think that's just the state of European countries, is that they're not expeditionary. There are a few militaries that are, and the United States is one. Now there are many nations that have joined in expeditionary missions, but the United States, again, back to that global order, we must have this expeditionary force projection model, and that makes us a totally different capability set, the ability to deploy troops into somewhere else to conduct whatever mission it is. And I think history is the best example of you're not going to know what that mission is. But I also preach a lot that we fund military, back to that 50% cut. We design them for the worst case scenario against the biggest threat we can imagine. And then we build that military. So, for us, it's a fight somewhere else against Russia, China. That's about it. And that's what we build our military, and we'll use it for a whole lot of other things. So on the dense urban thing, I think history is showing us that a weaker military, again, or a weaker non-state actor can go into any of these urban environments across the world and quickly dominate them and hold them for a short amount of time. Because whoever owns an urban area has, for a short amount of time, the advantage as a defender. Any defender of a city has the advantage because it takes all, even the U.S. military and all our advanced weapon technology is meant to engage out as far as possible, Desert Storm type missions where you're engaging them with everything before you even get close to them. And the urban takes that away. And I mean, from the European element, again, they have to build their militaries for the what capabilities they think they're going to need, and then make all these investments trade-offs. I mean, for urban, for them, and I think this should be true, is how do they use urban spaces to make any aggressing nation, and there's only one that we can think of that would do that by ground, pay for every inch of ground. So how do you defend urban areas to buy you time to allow for maybe somebody else to come join and reestablish the rules of the game? So how do you use your cities? How do you evacuate them quickly, but then draw in that advanced military, let's say Russia, and then make them pay for every inch, just like the Chechens did in Grozny. But for us, and I write a lot about us as a global. If you're going to say you're going to go anywhere and do any mission, you better start looking at the urban. And every one of these fights, we also have our ideals of what the rules will be in these fights, that we're going to empty the cities and just and destroy them. And we got the bad guys, so we did our job. I just was at a conference and saw the Philippine Battle of Mawari. I mean, it's a small city of 200,000, but they emptied it. 90% of the population was emptied, and then they had the fight that they wanted to have and totally destroyed it. So much so they haven't even reestablished the city yet. I think that kind of warfare is, again, not two nation states going at it, but that type of urban modern war is the future for the foreseeable, future, I guess.
And if you look if you look at
Go ahead.
Syria also, for example, Aleppo, I think that those are really drastic pictures. Whole cities turn into the concrete rubble.
Yeah. I want to ask you, Jyri, because these perspectives are so valuable. When you look as a nation, or yourself, your own personal view, when you see the U.S., why are we able to collect partners at the superpower level better than, say, a Russia or a China? Like any conflict, you're going to automatically get Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia are all automatically going to roll with us. Does that how do you guys see who we are? Are we a good agent? Are we just the best partner to have because of the military might? How does the US, how do we accomplish what we accomplish, and is it because we are doing things well, or is it because we're just the most lethal?
Well, I don't think it's only about being the most lethal. I think there's quite a lot what concerns the values and the kind of how you perceive the world. So I think there is a kind of a shared understanding about what our militaries are for, what our societies are for, open democratic societies. So I do think that is kind of the key strength. But of course, the U.S. And I totally agree with John what you said about you just can't compare the U.S. with Europe or any European states. It's just totally different in a way. The logic is different. The kind of the amount of military power in Europe and in the US, it's the asymmetry is just so big. So I do think that there are many states in Europe who really align their interests so that they are very well aligned with those of the US, and some states are even willing to use military power with the US in many cases. But I would say that it's not mostly a military thing. It's more it's a broader thing.
Yeah, I really want to hit on that. I mean, I think we talked about all throughout here about that diplomatic. We may not like it, and even though we're doing it too, but every nation seeks to build on their democratic relationships and economic ties to make to balance regional stability. You can say that they shouldn't be conducting relationships with Russia or China or whatever, but that's just a misunderstanding of how the world works. But we build relationships, and that's how you maintain order, and so you don't have to use your military.
So we're running out of time here, so we're going to have to do another one of these. But I want to be respectful of what you guys have to do the rest of the day, including for Jyri, go to sleep since it's so late over there. But I wanted to ask you, Jyri, when we're real hard on ourselves here in the U.S., we always want to do more, and we get cause fatigue over here because there's always something to worry about. But when you see the U.S.'s capability currently with our current administration, have we become a better partner over the last 2 years, or it's kind of the same, or do you have no idea? What do you think? Like with Donald Trump as erratic and as problematic as he is in terms of his actions, have we improved our standing with Finland in general or across the world? However you want to answer that.
Well, I think if I look at it from a European perspective, so for me as a Finn, what President Trump is saying and what the US is saying and actually has been saying for more than a decade is right, that Europe needs to do more defense-wise. So I agree with that. I do think that there are some methods about how this message is conveyed that could actually be counterproductive on the European scale if you look at the whole Europe. But I do think that Europeans know that the message is right. And I do think that there is a lot of pressure and a lot of willingness as well in Europe to do more. But of course, it's not an easy task to start spending money on defense after a couple of decades of the peace dividend and underinvestment. So it will take time. And as we talked already, building credible defenses, it's a long-term thing. So you need 10 years or 15 years of real additional investment in order that to carry the weight, so that the European defenses would kind of be restored to the level that they should be.
And John, I'm going to give you the last word in terms of our standing with the world, with an interesting president, but an excellent Secretary of Defense and Secretary Mattis. How do you see our role? Are we in a better position than we were in the previous 5 years, 6 years, or what do you think?
Yeah, now that I'm out of the military, I can say what I think. I think we're in a much better position for multiple reasons. One is, back to that funding in the military. Any Republican government usually invests more in their military. Just it's a risk measure whether you think that you should invest more or weigh on more of the diplomatic, information, economic perspective. But back to the if the world as a whole is over reliant on the United States to be that tripwire that's going to reestablish the agreement to the game, then I think we were right to say that that's true. But we all are a part of this. So if certain nations aren't investing in their defensive and they're just relying on somebody else to intervene, and it hurts us and it hurts this global order when we're all not a part of the equation, right? The United States isn't capable of being a global police force. But it's these shared international agreements that create this global order, and we're just a big part of it. But if we're all not invested in it, it starts to unravel, and it starts to be, that's a U.S. problem, and it's not.
I want to ask one more real quick question, and then we really will close out, I promise. Jyri and John, and we'll take them in that order, Jyri and then John. What aspect of modern warfare keeps you up at night? What's the thing that you just can't get past, Jyri?
Well, I think that quite a lot of what keeps me up at night is related to the fact that how are we in Europe doing? How are we conceptualizing war today and for the future? And I do see, quite a lot of different ways of approaching war and military operations. So I do think that, Europe should get its act together more in the future. And I hope that this will happen.
John?
So what keeps me up at night is the first 100 days. So the losing the first battle. So my wife is deployed in support of Afghanistan right now. The first battle, the U.S. is going to be okay in whatever fight comes up. But that first battle, whoever those troops are, the first battle, and God forbid it's an urban battle, it's going to cost a lot. It's going to cost a lot in soldiers' lives, and it's going to cost a lot in the global order if we're not preparing. And I'm the chair of urban warfare studies, so if we're not investing in that first battle to happen in whatever urban area, then we're doing a disservice.
Fellas, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. This is a great conversation. I've absolutely loved it. I always know that it's going to be interesting, but we had a completely different conversation that I might have envisioned, and that means I'm learning something. I'm stretching my brain, and even if the audience doesn't care, I think it's an awesome show. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.